Okay, let's jump right in. When you hear the word druid, what instantly pops into your head? If you're like most people, you're probably picturing a wizened old guy with a massive white beard, wearing a billowy robe, clutching a wooden staff, and casting magic spells deep in some misty forest. It's a fantastic pop culture trope, right? But today, we're going to look past the fantasy and explore the actual hidden life of the historical druids.
So, the big question driving today's explainer is this. Were druids really just forest wizards? Or is it possible that this whole fantasy caricature is actually hiding a reality that was far more powerful, deeply intellectual, and intensely secretive? Well, let's find out.
To really understand who they were, we got to start with the word itself. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates their connection to nature right from the get-go. The term druid actually comes from the ancient Proto-Celtic word druidus. That translates roughly to oak knower, or a priest with strong insight. Instantly, this linguistic root grounds us in history. We're stepping away from the modern myths and straight into the reality of ancient Celtic society, where these figures were deeply tied to the natural world.
It's a crazy contrast. Think about our pop culture druid. It's all magic spells, potions, and wizardry. But then look at the historical reality. These people were actually the highly sophisticated intellectual elites of the ancient Celtic world. We're talking about lawyers, natural scientists, astronomers, and massive political power brokers. The disconnect is staggering. What you really need to take away from this is that they weren't outcasts living in the woods, they were the absolute pillars of their society.
All right, Section 1, the polymaths.
We need to completely reframe how we view these folks, because they functioned as the ultimate multidisciplinary experts of Iron Age Europe. The astonishing array of societal roles they mastered is truly mind-blowing. Yes, for sure, they were religious leaders who presided over ceremonies, but they were also tribal arbiters and judges. They settled everything from private property disputes to major crimes. They were moral philosophers teaching about the immortality of the soul. They were astronomers tracking celestial bodies to build these incredibly complex lunar and solar calendars. Oh, and they were the community's medical doctors. They were absolutely indispensable.
And because they were so crucial to keeping society running, they got some pretty unbelievable privileges. The Roman general Julius Caesar actually noted that druids were entirely exempt from taxation and military service. Just think about that for a second. In an ancient, fiercely warrior-driven society, they were legally freed from going to war and freed from paying taxes. And why? All so they could dedicate their entire lives to intensive study and civil service.
Section 2. The Secret Society.
Now, you might be wondering, if they held all this incredible knowledge and power, how exactly did they keep it so intensely hidden from the rest of the world? Well, the answer starts with the number 20. Becoming a druid wasn't something you just did over a weekend retreat or a standard 4-year college degree. A novice initiate could study for up to an agonizing 20 years to fully earn the title. Just imagine doing a 20-year PhD. It was an absolute marathon of mental endurance.
What's really fascinating is how they studied for those 2 decades. Everything, and I mean literally everything, was based on an oral tradition. Initiates had to memorize vast bodies of ancient verse, master both tribal and international law, and memorize the complex movements of the stars. And here is the kicker. There was a strict, absolute ban on writing down any of their religious or philosophical doctrine. They actually knew the Greek alphabet, but they deliberately chose not to use it for their sacred teachings. This massive feat of human memory is the exact reason their lives remain so mysterious today. They left 0 written records of their own beliefs for us to find.
Moving on to Section 3, sacred groves and dark rituals.
So because they didn't write things down, we have to rely on accounts from outsiders who observed them. And these accounts give us some really evocative, sensory details of their religious practices out in nature, in sacred clearings known as nemistons. There's this amazing quote from the Roman author Pliny the Elder. He wrote that the Druids held nothing more sacred than mistletoe growing on an oak tree. Pliny paints this incredibly cinematic picture for us. Imagine a blazing fire, a white-robed priest climbing a sacred oak on the 6th day of the moon. He uses a golden sickle to carefully harvest the mistletoe, letting it fall into a pristine white cloth so it never even touches the ground, and that's followed by the sacrifice of 2 white bulls. It's a vivid, beautiful glimpse into their animistic belief that nature was filled with divine spirits.
But, it wasn't all just peacefully harvesting mistletoe. There's a really stark contrast in their rituals. On one hand, you have these beautiful votive offerings, where druids would drop highly valuable prestige goods, like swords, shields, and gold jewelry, into rivers, lakes, and bogs, as peaceful gifts to the gods. But classical authors like Julius Caesar describe some much darker realities. They claim Druids officiated animal and human sacrifices, most famously burning criminals alive inside a giant, terrifying wicker man.
This huge historical dissonance builds a picture of intense bias. You kind of have to ask yourself, who were they really? See, the Romans were actively trying to conquer the Celts in Gaul and Britain, so they often painted the Druids as barbaric, savage, and uncivilized. It was classic wartime propaganda used to justify military conquest. But the Greek view? Coming from writers who weren't actively at war with them, they often described the Druids as noble, just, and highly esteemed philosophers. The Greeks actually ranked the Druids alongside the greatest thinkers of the ancient world.
Section 4. The power behind kings.
Whether they were seen as savage barbarians or noble sages, there is one thing every single historical source agreed on. The Druids' absolute monopoly on religious and legal knowledge translated into unmatched, real-world political power. To really grasp this, think about this incredible detail from the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology. By law, no one was permitted to speak in the presence of the King of Ulster before the king himself had spoken. But there was one solitary exception to this rule. The king could not speak before his druid, Cathbod, had spoken first. That specific anecdote perfectly illustrates that a druid's authority didn't just support royalty, it actually superseded it. The kings were, in a lot of ways, subordinate to the druid's judgment.
And their influence extended way beyond the throne room. Druids possessed such deep moral and legal authority across the Celtic world that they could literally walk onto a battlefield, step right between two opposing armies drawn up and ready for slaughter, and demand peace. And the crazy part? The armies would actually listen. They could stop wars in their tracks. That is a level of unquestioned authority that is almost hard for us to comprehend today.
Which brings us to Section 5, Fade and Rebirth.
So what happened to them? Their decline and eventual rebirth spans centuries. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire finally conquered Gaul in Britain. Because the Druids held so much political power, the Romans systematically suppressed and outlawed their practices just to break the Celtic resistance. Then, by the 5th century CE, as Christianity spread into places Rome never even reached, like Ireland, the remaining Druids were reduced in the literature from elite philosophers to mere sorcerers and pagan magicians. But then, fast forward to the 1700s, a romantic revival sparked a renewed interest, eventually leading to the modern neo-Druidry movements we see today. They literally went from political power brokers to oppressed pagans, and finally to those romanticized mystics we picture today.
So here's a thought to wrap up this explainer. If the Druids had simply written down their secrets, their laws, their astronomy, their philosophy, would they still hold such incredible power over our imaginations today? The crucial takeaway here is that their mystery was entirely by their own design. Their reliance on the human mind over the written word ensured that while their specific spells and laws might be lost to time, their legacy as the ultimate wise ones of the forest is going to live on forever. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this leaves you incredibly curious to uncover more hidden histories.